to make an episode of my Netflix series at Serpent Mound. Initially they were welcoming, and then they heard that Graham Hancock was presenting the series. And immediately they turned around and said, no, filming permission is refused because Hancock's views differ from our own. Well, I was able to make a virtue of that in the sense that I stood at the gates of Serpent Mound, which were closed, and I read out their letter where they say that just because I don't agree with them, they won't allow me access to the site. Fortunately, we have masses of footage, drones, and other things, and we were able to do the show. But it shows, again, the limited mentality. And people must be very insecure in their ideas if they actually have to ban critics from expressing alternative ideas.
And what is the significance of Serpent Mound?
Well, the first and foremost thing is it's an incredible, beautiful, amazing site, which everybody who can get to Ohio should go and see. It's just a most incredible place. But secondly, there are indications that it's much older than it's supposed to be, and that has particularly to do with the way that the jaws of the serpent line up to the setting sun, and because the changing positions of the sunset due to changes in the Earth's motion.
So this is it here?
That's it there. We're looking at that's the head of the serpent, and is looking straight at the setting sun. And this alignment was perfect about 12,500 years ago. It's slightly off today, and that's because of changes in the rising point of the sun over thousands and thousands of years. And that's what they don't like. They don't want Serpent Mound to be older. There's one group of archaeologists think it's just 1,000 years old. Another group think, well, maybe it's 2,500 or 3,000 years old. But the notion that it might be 12,000 years old is something they don't want anybody to hear, really.
And is the evidence that it's 12,000 years old just based with the alignment of the sun, or is there other evidence?
No, there's other evidence as well. There's material from that time that have been found at Serpent Mound, and archaeologists consider it to be irrelevant to the date of Serpent Mound.
Yeah, material, like what kind of material?
Carbon datable material, objects, bits of wood that were burnt. People were there, people were doing stuff. It's clear that that site has been constructed and reconstructed multiple times over thousands and thousands of years. And this is a theme that I've found throughout making Ancient Apocalypse, that when you look at a particular site, what you're looking at is the latest incarnation of that site. But the site itself has been sacred for millennia, and it needs repair, it needs renovation, particularly if it's an earthen mound like Serpent Mound.
And so that is a theme that does seem to be repeated even under modern accepted archaeological understandings of ancient sites, like the Parthenon and the Acropolis.
Well, less so.
Less so in terms of the timeline.
Less so in terms of the timeline. I mean, one of the sites we visited for the series is an incredible pyramid in Mexico, at a place called Cholula, and it is in fact the largest pyramid in the world. Very few people have even heard of it, but it's a much bigger pyramid than the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. It's not as high, but its footprint is massive. So it's a huge, humongous thing sitting there on the ground, and it turns out that inside it are 4 other pyramids that were built on top of what we see now. What we see now was built on top of those older pyramids, and then at the very heart of it is a sort of sacred spring that seems to have been the reason for the creation of that. And we again explore the possibility that the origins of this site may be much older than the archaeological dating.
So how long did it take you guys to do this series?
Well, to be clear, it was the series is me, and it's me making it, but Randall plays an incredibly important role in the series. Randall and I are comrades in arms. We're working together against the mainstream to bring an alternative point of view, and Randall is the star of episode 8. And episode 8 is the episode where we bring the whole story of the ancient apocalypse together. The terrible things that happened to this world, the terrible things. That was the time when all the great megafauna went extinct, the saber-toothed tigers, the woolly rhinos, and so on and so forth. They all went extinct between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And there's evidence of just utterly cataclysmic flooding in North America, particularly in the Channel Scablands in the Pacific Northwest. And that flooding came off the ice cap, and something made it come off the ice cap really, really fast. And Randall has just devoted years of his life to studying this mystery, what really went on there. And let's not underestimate it. Let's just not talk about lakes bursting their banks. Let's talk about something huge that took place, and the landscape speaks to that huge event.
And Randall, you've discussed this on the podcast before, but in the interest of making this a standalone show, we should probably get into it before. You came up with this idea. At what year was it when that idea first came to your mind? That remember you were telling me you were on acid. You were looking at how
that was 1969.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite formulate a specific theory at that point.
But you had a thought.
I had an impression. I call it an impression. I was looking at an underfit river. You know what that is?
No.
Jamie, can we do a map? And I'm going to show it. I'm going to show
man,
you
easy, man.
exactly what we're talking about here. I'm going to zoom in on. Okay, well.
Oh, here you go. Nice. A little HDMI action. Okay.
All right, you're going to learn a new term, Joe. It's underfit river. Okay, so it was a little different back in 1969, but Eden Prairie was a location of an airport. Let me put this onto terrain. All right, here we go. And let me see. Here we go. So this is the Minnesota River Valley. And I was standing, I actually went back and a few years ago, found the spot I was standing, and it was right here on this bluff, looking into this valley. Now, if you go here, you can see there's another side to it over here. And if you look back here, you're going to see this is what's an underfit river. An underfit river is where the modern river is diminutive relative to the channel that it's flowing in. And the channel was part of what they called the spillway of Lake Agassiz, which was a gigantic meltwater lake that formed in that interval that Graham was just talking about. So this is the modern Minnesota River, which is a fairly substantial river, probably close to the Colorado here that runs through Austin. But you can see the channel. The channel is huge relative to the river. A few geologists have worked on it and concluded that the meltwater flow through here was 4,000 times greater than the modern flow of the
It's a video shader, man.
So anyways, I was standing here looking out into this, and what I saw was the modern river entrenched within a couple of banks, and then I'm looking at this huge channel, and I just had this impression that, was this a huge river channel? You know how, because see when I was looking 3 miles across, there's another set of 200-foot high bluffs matching the ones that I was standing on. And then below me was the modern Minnesota River with its banks, which were like miniature versions of the bluffs. Now, it was a full decade before I actually came back to the idea as I was beginning to learn more about catastrophism, which was still very much in the seminal stages back in the, say, the 70s. You know, we've learned so much more about the catastrophic history of this planet since then. But then I began to think, well, and this was before I even knew about Glacial River Warren, it was called, which was the flow through here. And you can actually, I took Graham, we went there. If we chased,
We did indeed.
we did. Right up here by Ortonville is Big Stone, see Big Stone City? So this is the southern outlet of Lake Agassiz. And this was one of the outburst floods, many outburst floods of gigantic flows of meltwater coming off the ice sheet. Big Stone City. Now, when you look at names of lakes and towns and places, oftentimes there's clues, like Big Stone City and Big Stone Lake. If you go there, there's big stones laying all over the landscape that were flushed out in this catastrophic draining of Lake Agassiz.
Because these drainings would have involved not just water, but icebergs.
Yes.
Turbulent flows of water filled with icebergs the size of oil tankers. And inside those icebergs, locked up, are huge chunks of rock. And eventually the iceberg melts and it releases the rock, and that's how you get the big stone.
Yeah. And then the last place we went, Graham, was the potholes at St. Croix Falls. I'll zoom in here. And this is an interesting place. There's a constriction in the bedrock. This is hard basalt bedrock. And when you have water flow coming along, it's got a conservation of volume, so that if you have a narrow part of the channel, the water coming in as it's going into that constricted channel speeds up, because if you take measure of the water flow at any 2 points along the channel, it's going to be the same. Whether it's a wide channel with shallower water moving slower, or a narrow channel with deeper water moving faster, the discharge through that channel is going to be the same. Well, what happens is if it comes into a constriction, it has to speed up then. When it speeds up, it becomes more erosive. And that's exactly what happened right here at Taylor's Falls. And right here at Interstate Park is a series of gigantic potholes. Now, these potholes are evidence of intense turbulence within swiftly moving deep water. In a minute here, I'll pull up. I've got a great shot. When Graham and I were there, I was in the bottom of one of these potholes, and Graham is peering over the rim. And it's a great shot because you can really get the sense of the scale. I'll pull it up here in a second. But if we go, where did this water come from? This water came from right up here, Lake Nipigon. That was the source of this water. And when you go south of Lake Nipigon, the whole landscape is channel scablands, just like Graham and I were seeing out in Washington. And this is very convincing evidence of really catastrophic water flows. And I've always thought it's interesting, or at least for the last decade or so, that if you look at the elevation of the land here, you look at the elevation of the land over here, it's the same. But if you go in the middle here, it's 500 to 1,000 feet lower. What happened here, there was a major discharge south out of Lake Nipigon, came down through.
And I think we should add that Lake Nipigon was discharging because it was filled up with water that came out of the ice cap.
Yes, yes.
What is the conventional explanation for these massive bluffs that are very far apart from each other with a relatively small river running through the middle?
Try as I might, I've never found an explanation. But you can look here at this, and this is pure what you call scabland, which is the result of major erosional, intense erosion, cutting out. This is a coulee, but you
It looks
look
like
at
somebody's just been picking scabs off the skin of the land, and that was these water flows rushing through it, filled with icebergs and whole forests ripped up by their roots. Naturally, it looks like torn up scabs.
And so it's your assertion that this all came out of the cataclysm, that this all came out of the impacts, comet impacts?
James Teller, a geologist, has dated these flows 12,800 to 12,900 years ago.
And how has he done that?
Radiocarbon dating primarily, by finding if you have a flood and it's picking up anything organic, bone, wood, whatever, and then you look in those deposits and you sample, and the samples, let's say because it's a flood, what it's going to do, it's going to pick up younger and older material because it's washing away, it's excavating other land, and so what you do is you get enough datable material, and if it keeps coming up that the maximum age is a given age, that's probably when the flood happened, or a minimum age rather, not a maximum age. In other words, a flood might pick up stuff that's 15,000 years old and 12,000. Well, when did the flood happen? At 15,000 or 12,000? So what you do is you look for the youngest datable material, and that should usually give you a pretty good idea of when the flood happened. So James Teller has dated this overflow here, and again, it comes out perfectly consistent with the Younger Dryas.
I think it's important to add at that point that there's a reason for all of this, and this is a huge controversy in science at the moment. We know that there was enormous flooding 12,800 years ago. The question is what caused it? Why did it happen there? And there's a very powerful theory, which is now backed by more than 100 mainstream scientists, that the Earth passed through the debris stream of a disintegrating comet. And that theory is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And those several bits of that disintegrating comet might have been pretty big, maybe up to 1 kilometer in diameter. And they landed on the North American ice cap, generating huge amounts of heat. Tremendous shock wave hits the ice cap. And it turns that ice into water, and it rushes down southwards, fills up these lakes, overflows these lakes, and tears up the landscape underneath it. And this Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is by far, in my view, the best explanation of what's going on. I'm very happy to say that the Comet Research Group, the 100 scientists who are behind this, they've been funding their own research for nearly 2 decades because no big mainstream institution would get behind them. But just in the last couple of years, some big funding has come into the Comet Research Group. And they're now in a position to go look at Antarctic ice, to go look at all the evidence from all over the world that shows that this cataclysm did happen 12,800 years ago, and that we're dealing with something really that is almost unimaginable in its scope, and which should change the way that we look at the history of the human species if it were not for this resistance. I wonder if we could just show a short clip which has got Randall in it. The Randall clip.
It's just so slow.
Which is from the Ancient Apocalypse show, where Randall makes the point at the end of it that once we take this into account, the whole story of history is going to change completely, and that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for some recognition that something really important is missing.
Ancient structures, built with surprising sophistication,
It's the most amazing archaeostratus site in North America.
revealing the fingerprints of an advanced
It's just so
prehistoric
dumb.
civilization.
Like, it's just so fucking dumb.
The possibility of civilization emerging earlier than we think gets much stronger.
It's going to absolutely demand a rewrite of history as we know it.
And this is the point. This is why I've made this series, because that idea has to get out there. That we got to stop being so complacent about how we look at our past, and for the very same reason, we need to stop being so complacent about how we look at our future as well. We live in a hazardous cosmic environment. It just happens that we live at a time in the human story where, if we chose to do so, we could actually do something about it.
What motivated you to get involved in this? Like, I know Fingerprints of the Gods you released in the 90s. It was
1995.
That's when I first read it, and I became obsessed. What motivated you to put that out?
It was a process, really. I used to be a current affairs journalist. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. I had no interest in history whatsoever, but I began to come across things, particularly traveling initially in Ethiopia and then in Egypt, which made me wonder about the past. And, standing in front of the Great Pyramid of Egypt is an awe-inspiring experience, especially when you've never seen it before. And in 1989, when I first saw it, I had never seen it before. 6 million tons, 481 foot high, 13-acre footprint, this massive thing. And archaeologists are saying it's just the tomb of a pharaoh, and yet no pharaoh's body was ever found inside it, or indeed inside any ancient Egyptian pyramid. There had to be another explanation. And I've always been a contrarian. I've always tried to give an opposite point of view. I hate it when there's just a single narrative that says this is the truth and there is no other truth. And so I felt it was important to start giving an alternative point of view, and I started to look into it in depth. Could there be something missing from the story of our past? And that's why I ended up writing Fingerprints of the Gods, to put that information before the public, to allow people access to information that they had not had access to before, and to begin to think for themselves instead of just accepting the word of the so-called experts. The experts know a great deal. I couldn't do anything I do without the work that archaeologists do, but they shouldn't be given a monopoly over the story of the human past. Our past belongs to us. It belongs to all of us. And everybody, whether they're an academic or whether they're a man in the street, they've got something to contribute to the idea of our past.
And the Younger Dryas impact theory, when was that first brought out?
2007. That was when it first brought out. It immediately caught my eye. Because when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I proposed that there had been a gigantic global cataclysm about 12,500 years ago. But I didn't really know what had caused it. I suggested a number of possibilities. And then suddenly in 2007, out comes this hypothesis with mainstream backing by mainstream scientists, saying that it looks like there was a series, not just one impact, but multiple impacts all over the Earth around 12,800 years ago that caused this cataclysm. And I began to follow that theory. And by about 2013, it became clear to me that these scientists were onto something really big. And I dived back into it and ended up writing another couple of books, Magicians of the Gods and America Before, which we talked about in your show back in 2019, just to try to put that information out there. And it's fascinating, really, and very lazy, the way that archaeologists react to an alternative point of view. In my case, they almost never get to grips with the material that I put out there in the books. They just say, oh, Hancock, he's a pseudoscientist. He's a fraud. He's a liar. But they never say why I'm a pseudoscientist, why I'm a fraud, or why I'm a liar. They just throw those words out, and you go to Wikipedia, and that's what you see. And the point about Wikipedia is that's the first place, if somebody hears my name or hears about my ideas, first place they're going to go have a look is Wikipedia. And immediately they're going to get turned off. And you can't edit my Wikipedia page. They've locked it. And it's controlled by a group of academics. So I do find this incredibly irritating. But the only thing to do is to keep on going. And this is why, frankly, Joe, your show has been so important. Because you're one of the very few people who's allowed this information to get out to the general public, this contrary information which the mainstream doesn't want to hear. You're a powerful platform that's allowed this information to reach so many more people than it otherwise would have reached, and I'm grateful to you for that.
Well, I'm grateful to you guys. I'm really grateful because it's such an exciting notion. It's such an exciting idea, and it makes sense when you look at these incredible structures that we don't really have an explanation for. And when we think about the conventional dating of modern history and modern civilization, they want to put it at around 6,000-ish years ago.
That's right. That's right. And then, you know, that was the view really for decades, that civilization began about 6,000 years ago. And before that, there was no such thing as civilization. And they say that the first big megalithic structures were created by societies that were already agricultural societies. So they were generating surpluses, which allowed specialists to have the time to learn how to be architects and engineers and builders. But then suddenly, out of the blue, and we've got an episode on this in the series, comes Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old. It's 5,000 years old than the supposed oldest megalithic structures, and it's a fucking enormous megalithic structure, probably the biggest megalithic structure on Earth, because so much of it is still underground, although we know what's there because of ground-penetrating radar. Highly sophisticated, 20-ton pillars, beautiful astronomical alignments, deliberately buried by the people who created it.
Thanks for here. I'm only gonna play for another 8 more minutes, to be honest. I'm not gonna play for the full hour. I need to unwind and do random stuff.
Somehow megalithic architecture began thousands of years before we thought it began. How are we going to explain this? And they have to accept that this is one of the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. That the archaeology does show this quite clearly, that when the work began on Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, the entire population there were hunter-gatherers. They were not agriculturalists, generating those supposed surpluses that would allow experts in architecture to emerge. They were hunter-gatherers. And how, in God's name, do a group of hunter-gatherers wake up one morning and create something like this enormous scale? And then the mystery deepens, because at the same time that they're building the megalithic site, they're also suddenly doing agriculture. And I look at that as a contrarian. And I say, I actually don't think that this was something that was just dreamed up overnight by a group of hunter-gatherers. I think I'm looking at a transfer of technology. I think people came to that site who already knew how to do this stuff. And maybe they used that site to mobilize the local population, to push them into a new direction. And that was truly the beginnings of civilization as we know it. But I think it was a restarting of civilization, a reboot, not the actual beginnings. I think there was an earlier lost civilization. And that's the whole point of the show I've made.
One should mention about that particular date, 11,600.
Well, it's incredibly important. It's an incredibly important date because the Younger Dryas begins 12,800 years ago with a cataclysm, with a puzzling, mysterious rise in sea level at the same point, 1,000 years of freezing temperatures, mass extinctions of animal species all over the world, and then 11,600 years ago, global temperature shoots up The last of the ice caps collapse into the sea. Sea level rises enormously. That is the date that work starts at Göbekli Tepe, and it's a point I've made many times, but it's really worth making because archaeologists roll their eyes every time you say the word Atlantis. But that is precisely the date that Plato, which is the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis, that's precisely the date he gives for the destruction of Atlantis. 11,600 years before our time. He puts it this way, that his ancestor Solon visited Egypt, and we know about that visit. It's historically recorded. That visit to Egypt was in 600 BC. And there Solon claimed to have been told by Egyptian priests about this great advanced civilization that once existed, but that angered the gods and was destroyed in an enormous flood. And Solon asked those Egyptian priests, when did this happen? And they said, 9,000 years ago. Well, do the math. That's in 600 BC. That's 9,000 years before 600 BC. We call that 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's exactly the date of the end of the Younger Dryas, and it's exactly the date of what is called Meltwater Pulse 1b, one of the biggest single rises overnight in sea level that ever occurred. So if Plato made it up, it's really weird that he picked a date that is precisely a date that coincides with the latest geological evidence on cataclysmic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age.
Could be a coincidence, but
A pretty good one.
I will mention I did a two-parter on all of the what Graham's just talking about and the geological evidence that confirms or refutes Plato's account, and it's available on my website for download. And it's like 7 hours of detailed
Yeah, you go deep, bro. You go deep.
And you see, the academics have never bothered to do this because they, in their pride and in their arrogance, they just say, we know that Plato just made it up, that it's just a fantasy. They don't know that. And it's people like Randall coming from the outside who are actually doing the legwork that makes us think about all this again.
And there's plenty of evidence that there were many sites like this that were thought to be just legend and myth, like Troy, for instance. That has now been proven to be an actual real city that mimics the initial descriptions of it, the historical descriptions.
We should never dismiss myths. We should always listen to them. They're the memory bank of our species, and they may be expressed in symbolic language. There may be wonderful stories built around them, but at the core is factual information. And what better way to ensure that factual information is passed down to the future than to record it in a fantastic story that people will pass on. People love telling stories, and they don't even need to understand what the heart of the story is. As long as it's a great story, they're going to keep on passing it down to the future. So I think myth is very important, and that's something that we do in my Netflix series, is we look at the myths. The story of Atlantis is not alone. There are thousands of traditions from all around the world speaking of a global flood that destroyed a former civilization, that brought to an end the Golden Age.
With all this physical evidence and with all these myths, are there more and more people that are accepting this or exploring this with curiosity and open-mindedness now?
I would say yes, and one of the things that makes me confident that that's happening is because I am getting a lot of emails and communications from people, young people going, you know what, I was watching your stuff and Graham's stuff, I've decided I'm going to go into geology. Yeah. I mean, I've gotten dozens, or I'm going to go into paleontology, or archaeoastronomy, or archaeology. So just the fact that I'm getting those kinds of communications from people, that's every time I get one, that's encouraging to me. Because I think it's the old axiom that, sometimes, in order to evolve past an entrenched theory, the gatekeepers have to pass away and a new generation has to come along who's a little more willing to look outside that dogmatic framework.
Well, also, if you are a young archaeologist and you're trying to carve your way in the world, what better way than to explore this with tons of evidence that's very controversial theory that's been dismissed.
Takes courage, though. Takes courage on the part of those archaeologists, because they can lose any hope of promotion if they touch ideas like this. Archaeology is a very restricted discipline. If you don't copy what your professor says, if you go off on a tangent, they'll cut you off. There's so many people who've done such great work in archaeology that doesn't fit with the mainstream, and they just get isolated by their colleagues.
I'm hopeful. I really am. And one of the things that gives me hope is Brian Murarescu's, the reception of his material. That book, The Immortality Key, which is fantastic, which points to
which I wrote the foreword to.
Yes, and you did that podcast with us remotely.
Yeah.
When we did that, and he expressed all this information, we talked about these ancient clay vessels that show clear evidence of some sort of psychedelic that was mixed in with wine. That was probably the origins of a lot of even democracy, a lot, like the Enlightenment. A lot of it came from these meetings, and people came from all over the world to participate in these rituals.
Like later,
this is now being widely accepted, and it's a field of study at Harvard.
Yeah, and let's think about it. If you're locked, this is one of the reasons why psychedelics are being so successful in healing people with profound depression. Because what is profound depression otherwise that you're locked in a very narrow frame that you just can't escape from? And what psychedelics seem to do is they break that lock, and they allow a kind of openness to come in, and new thoughts to come in. So it's not surprising that psychedelics revolutionized the ancient world. And I'm absolutely convinced that there isn't a religion in the world, and this